If you sign that, you're handing your company over. The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the boardroom like a crack in glass, and for a split second, even the air seemed to hold its breath as Richard Cole's pen hovered exactly 1 inch above the final page. The polished mahogany table reflecting the cold white lights above, a dozen executives frozen mid-motion, eyes shifting toward the source, a young black girl standing near the wall where no one important ever stood, her janitor badge catching a faint glint of light against her worn jacket, completely out of place among tailored suits and million-dollar decisions, and yet her gaze didn't waver as she looked straight at the contract, not at the CEO, not at the investors, just at the paper, like she could already see what was about to happen. Richard didn't even turn his head fully, just a slight flick of his eyes, dismissive, practiced. The kind of look that had shut down entire teams without a word. "We're in the middle of something," he said flatly, his voice low but edged with irritation, and a few quiet chuckles slipped around the table, subtle, controlled, reinforcing the invisible hierarchy that had already decided she didn't belong here. But Ava Johnson stepped forward anyway, one small step that felt louder than anything else in the room, her sneakers barely making a sound against the marble floor. "Page 17. She said, steady now, clearer. Subsection C." And that was when a few of the lawyers shifted in their seats, not alarmed yet, but curious enough to glance down at their copies, while one of the senior partners leaned back with a faint smirk, whispering something under his breath, and Richard exhaled slowly, impatience tightening in his jaw as he lowered the pen just slightly, closer to the paper, closer to the signature line that would finalize a deal worth over $2.4 billion. The number hanging unspoken in the room like a silent countdown. "Security will escort you out," he said without looking at her again, already done with the interruption, already returning to the version of reality where control never slipped. But Ava didn't move, not immediately, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides as if holding on to something invisible, something heavier than fear. "It transfers all liability to you," she added, the words landing softer this time, but somehow heavier, and now the room wasn't laughing anymore, not really, just small glances, small shifts, the kind of movement that meant doubt had entered the space, even if no one wanted to admit it yet, and as two security guards began walking toward her from the far side of the room, their footsteps measured and calm, Richard's pen dipped lower, the tip nearly touching the paper, a single motion away from locking in everything, his reflection faintly visible in the glossy surface of the table, controlled, confident, certain, and yet something, just something, flickered in his eyes for the briefest moment, like a thought he hadn't invited, like a question he didn't want to hear, while Ava's voice, now quieter, almost lost beneath the hum of the room, still carried enough to reach him. "You won't see it unless you read the last line." And that was when his hand stopped, not dramatically, not suddenly, just a pause, barely noticeable, but real, the pen hovering again, suspended in the space between decision and consequence as the entire room unknowingly leaned into that silence. The pen did not touch the paper, not yet, and that almost invisible pause stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the faint hum of the overhead lights to become noticeable, long enough for one of the junior analysts to shift uncomfortably in his chair, long enough for Ava Johnson to feel her own heartbeat steady instead of race. Because she knew something had changed even if no one else in that room wanted to admit it. Richard Cole slowly leaned back a fraction of an inch, the movement controlled, deliberate, as if adjusting posture rather than reconsidering a decision worth billions, his eyes finally dropping to the contract again. Not scanning, not skimming, but actually reading, and that alone was enough to unsettle the rhythm of the room, because men like him did not reread documents at the last second, they signed them. That was the point of power, that was the expectation everyone around that table had built their confidence on, and yet now the pages made a soft sound as he turned them back, one sheet sliding over another, precise, quiet, unmistakable, while across from him one of the investors cleared his throat lightly, the kind of polite interruption that carried pressure without sounding like it. "Is there a concern, Mr. Cole?" he asked, voice smooth, measured, but the question did not receive an immediate answer, because Richard's gaze had narrowed just slightly, focusing on a block of text that most people would have ignored, dense legal language tucked into the lower half of page 17, exactly where Ava had pointed, and for the first time since the meeting began, his expression shifted, not dramatically, just a tightening at the corner of his eyes, a subtle change in the set of his jaw, the kind of reaction only visible if you were close enough to see it, and Ava saw it. Even from across the room, even with 2 security guards now standing just a few feet away from her, waiting for instruction that had not yet been repeated, her hands no longer tense but still, grounded, as if she had already accepted whatever outcome came next, because the truth had already been spoken, and that mattered more than whether anyone chose to listen. One of the senior attorneys reached for his own copy, flipping quickly to the same page, his fingers moving faster now, less confident than before. His brow furrowing as he traced a line of text, then another, until his posture shifted forward, attention sharpened, while the quiet murmur that followed was not loud but impossible to ignore, a ripple moving through the room as more eyes dropped to the document, more pages turned, more silence filled the spaces where certainty had been just moments ago, and Richard finally spoke, not to the room, not to the investors, but almost to himself. "This clause," he said slowly, the words measured, careful. "It shifts post-merger liability." And he stopped there, because finishing that sentence would mean saying it out loud, would mean acknowledging that a deal constructed over months, reviewed by entire legal teams, had a flaw hidden in plain sight, and that the person who caught it was not sitting at the table but standing by the wall in a janitor's jacket, and the weight of that realization pressed into the room without needing to be announced. The investor across from him leaned forward now, less composed. "Our legal team has vetted every line," he said, but there was a crack in that certainty, small but there, and Richard did not look up, did not respond immediately, his finger now resting on the exact line Ava had mentioned, reading it again, slower this time, and the pen that had been seconds away from finalizing everything was now set gently on the table beside the contract. No sound, no declaration, just a quiet decision that shifted everything without a single raised voice. No one spoke after the pen touched the table, not signed, just resting there, but somehow louder than if it had slammed down, because in that quiet, every person in the room understood that something had gone wrong, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone if ignored. Richard Cole remained still for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the contract, not blinking as he read the same line again, slower this time, letting each word settle into meaning instead of assumption. And across the table the investor shifted forward, no longer relaxed, no longer in control of the pace. "This is standard language," he said, but his voice carried less weight now, thinner, like it had lost something it depended on. Richard finally looked up, not at Ava, not yet, but at his own legal team, his gaze sharp, direct. "Did anyone flag this clause?" he asked, and the question did not sound angry, which made it worse, because it left no room for defense, only truth. One of the senior attorneys adjusted his glasses, flipping quickly through his copy, pages moving faster than before. "It appears to be a liability allocation provision," he said carefully, choosing words that did not commit, did not confirm, but Richard did not accept that distance. "It transfers all downstream legal exposure to us," he said, finishing the thought out loud now, and the room shifted again, chairs creaking slightly, a few quiet exhales breaking the silence, because now it was no longer a possibility, it was a reality spoken into the air, and Ava Johnson stood exactly where she had been, the security guards no longer reaching for her, no longer moving at all, their attention pulled into the same gravity that held everyone else, her eyes steady, not triumphant, not fearful, just present, as if she had already lived this moment in her mind and knew it would come. One of the analysts at the far end of the table leaned forward, voice lower, cautious. "If that clause holds, any post-merger litigation, regulatory penalties, or compliance failures would fall entirely on our side." And the numbers behind that statement did not need to be spoken: billions in exposure, years of consequences, the kind of damage that did not just affect a company but everyone tied to it. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, and he turned his head, slowly this time, toward the wall where Ava stood, really looking at her for the first time, not as background, not as interruption, but as the person who had just altered the trajectory of everything in that room. You, he said, the word simple but carrying weight now. Say it again. And it was not a command meant to dismiss, it was a request, precise, controlled, but undeniably different from before, the shift subtle yet absolute. Ava took a small step forward, her voice calm, measured. The clause is structured to look like a shared risk provision, but the wording in the final sentence overrides that. It assigns full liability to your company under any failure scenario after the merger. And as she spoke, more heads nodded slowly, reluctantly, pieces connecting, understanding forming in real time, while the investor leaned back, his expression tightening, no longer confident, no longer certain of the outcome he had walked in expecting. Richard listened without interrupting, without looking away, his hand resting flat on the table now, the pen untouched beside it, and when Ava finished, the silence that followed was different from before, no longer dismissive, no longer dismissing her presence, but heavy with acknowledgement, the kind that did not need applause, did not need words. Just a quiet, undeniable shift in who held the truth in the room. The room did not return to normal after that, it could not, because something fundamental had shifted and everyone could feel it without needing to say it out loud. Richard Cole leaned back in his chair slightly, his fingers resting still against the edge of the table, his gaze no longer scanning the contract but fixed somewhere deeper, as if recalculating not just the deal but the chain of decisions that had led them here. Across from him the investor straightened his posture, adjusting his cufflinks with controlled precision, trying to reclaim a sense of authority that had quietly slipped. "We can clarify the language," he said, voice steady but carrying a faint edge now. "This is a matter of interpretation." But the words did not land the way they would have 10 minutes earlier, not after the silence had already exposed too much. Richard did not respond immediately, instead he reached forward and closed the contract. Slowly, the soft thud of the pages meeting echoing more than it should have in the stillness, a small sound that carried a finality no one could ignore. "No," he said, calm, direct, not loud, but absolute, and that single word settled into the room like a line drawn across the floor, not aggressive, not emotional, just clear. One of the attorneys shifted in his seat, glancing toward the investor, then back to Richard, uncertain where to align himself now that certainty had fractured, while Ava Johnson remained standing near the wall, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, not searching for recognition, not waiting for approval, simply present in the moment she had already risked everything to speak into. Richard's eyes moved back to her again, slower this time, more deliberate, taking in details he had not noticed before, the worn edges of her jacket, the faint ink mark on her fingers, the way she stood without shrinking despite the weight of the room, and something in his expression softened, not visibly to everyone, but enough to shift the tone beneath his voice when he spoke again. "How did you catch it?" he asked, and this time the question was not rhetorical, not dismissive, it was real. Ava hesitated for half a second, not out of fear, but because the answer was simpler than they expected. "I read it," she said quietly, and a few heads turned again, not because the answer was complicated, but because it was not, because it implied that what had been missed by teams of professionals had been visible all along to anyone willing to look closely enough. The investor leaned back now, his earlier confidence replaced by calculation, eyes narrowing slightly as he studied Ava, measuring, reassessing, but saying nothing, because the ground had shifted too far to pretend otherwise. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand moving to rest flat on the closed contract, not claiming it, not rejecting it, just holding the space where a decision had almost been made. "We are done here for today," he said, his tone controlled but final, and the reaction was immediate but quiet, chairs moving back, papers being gathered, conversations held in low voices as people processed what had just happened, the kind of moment that would not make headlines but would be remembered by everyone in that room, while Ava remained where she was, not moving to follow the others, not rushing to leave, because for her the moment was not about the deal, it was about the truth she had chosen to speak when it would have been easier to stay silent. And as the room began to empty, Richard stood, the movement slow, deliberate, his eyes still on her, not with disbelief anymore, but with something closer to recognition, as if he was only now beginning to understand what he had almost ignored. The boardroom emptied in layers, not all at once, but in careful, quiet movements, as if no one wanted to be the first to fully acknowledge what had just happened. Chairs slid back with soft friction against the polished floor, documents were gathered a little too quickly, conversations kept low and controlled, yet charged beneath the surface, because everyone understood that a deal worth billions had just been stopped by someone who had not even been invited to the table. Ava Johnson remained where she was, near the wall, her hands relaxed at her sides now, her breathing steady, not searching for attention, not expecting anything, because moments like this did not usually end with recognition for people like her. They ended with silence, with being told to leave, with being reminded of where she belonged, and for a brief second, as the last few executives passed by without meeting her eyes, that familiar outcome seemed to settle back into place. One of the assistants glanced at her, then quickly looked away, unsure whether to speak or pretend she had never been part of the moment at all, while across the room Richard Cole stood still, watching the space clear, his expression unreadable, his mind moving through something deeper than the meeting itself, deeper than the contract now resting closed on the table. He had built a career on certainty, on trusting systems, on believing that structure and hierarchy filtered out error, and yet a flaw that large had passed through every layer without being stopped, until a voice from outside that system had cut through it. And that realization did not sit easily, not because it challenged his authority, but because it exposed a blind spot he had never considered. The room grew quieter with each passing second until the sound of the door closing at the far end left only two people inside, the distance between them still marked by the long table that had defined everything just moments ago. Ava shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just adjusting her stance as if preparing to leave without drawing attention, because that was what she had learned to do, to exit before being asked, to disappear before becoming a problem. But before she could move, Richard's voice stopped her, not sharp, not commanding, just clear. "Wait!" And the word carried enough weight to hold her in place without force. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his again, and for the first time there was no barrier of titles or assumptions between them, just two people standing in the aftermath of a decision that had not been made. Richard walked around the table instead of staying behind it, a small choice that shifted the space between them, removing the physical divide that had defined the room earlier. His steps measured, deliberate, until he stood a few feet away, not towering, not distant, just present. "You said you read it?" he began, his tone steady but quieter now, as if the room itself demanded a different kind of conversation. Ava nodded once, her voice calm. "Yes, sir." And he paused for a moment, not because he did not have words, but because he was choosing them more carefully than before. "Do you always read things like that?" he asked, and the question was simple, but what sat behind it was not. Ava's gaze dropped briefly to the table, then back to him. "When I can," she said, and there was no pride in the answer, no attempt to impress, just truth, the kind that did not need decoration. Richard studied her for a second longer, seeing now what he had overlooked before, not just a girl in a uniform, but someone who had paid attention when others had assumed, someone who had spoken when others had remained silent, and the weight of that settled quietly between them, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but undeniable, as the light from the tall windows shifted slightly across the floor, stretching longer, softer, marking the end of something that had almost gone very differently. The room felt different now, not empty, but quieter in a way that carried weight, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what had almost happened and were still holding on to it. The late afternoon light stretching across the polished floor in long, pale lines, softening the sharp edges of the space that had once felt rigid and controlled. Ava Johnson stood still, not out of uncertainty, but because there was no clear instruction left to follow, no script for what came after being heard when you were not supposed to be. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her jacket, a small grounding motion, familiar, steady, while Richard Cole remained a few steps away. His posture no longer rigid with authority but settled into something more reflective, his eyes not scanning for flaws or decisions, but simply observing, taking in the moment without rushing past it, As if for the first time in a long while, he allowed silence to exist without needing to control it. Most people in that room did not see it, he said finally, his voice lower now, almost blending into the quiet around them, not a statement meant to challenge, but one that acknowledged something deeper than the contract itself. Ava did not answer immediately, not because she did not have a response, but because she understood what he was really asking, the question beneath the words, the gap between what should have been obvious and what had been ignored. She glanced briefly toward the table, the closed folder still resting there, then back at him. Sometimes people stop looking when they think they already know what they are seeing, she said, her tone calm, not critical, just honest, and the words settled between them without resistance. Richard let out a slow breath, almost a quiet exhale of recognition, the kind that comes when something uncomfortable aligns with truth. He nodded slightly, more to himself than to her, his gaze shifting toward the windows where the light had softened into a warm glow, casting reflections that blurred the sharp lines of the city outside. I have spent years trusting the process, he said, the words measured, thoughtful, believing that if enough eyes reviewed something, it had to be right. And there was no bitterness in his voice, only a quiet realization that systems, no matter how refined, still depended on people choosing to see clearly. Ava listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, not stepping into the space, not pulling away from it, simply present in a way that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And today, he continued, turning his attention back to her, someone outside that process saw what no one else did. And there was no disbelief in his tone now, no hesitation, just acknowledgement, the kind that did not need to be emphasized to be understood. Ava lowered her gaze for a brief moment, not out of discomfort, but because she had never expected the moment to extend this far, never expected to be standing here, being asked, being heard. The path she had followed into that room had not been planned, it had been instinct, something that told her to speak even when it was not her place, and now that instinct had shifted. Something she could not fully measure. The quiet stretched again, but it was not empty, it carried a sense of pause, of reflection, of something recalibrating beneath the surface. Richard's hand moved slightly, resting against the back of a chair, not gripping it, just grounding himself in the physical space. What were you planning to do if I signed it? He asked, and this time there was a hint of something different in his voice, not doubt, not fear, but curiosity. Ava met his eyes again. Steady, clear? I would have kept speaking, she said simply, and the answer did not carry defiance, it carried certainty, the kind that did not depend on being accepted, and for a moment, that was the only thing in the room that felt completely solid, completely real. As the light continued to shift, casting longer shadows, marking the quiet transition from what almost happened to what had been prevented, the silence did not break right away, it settled deeper, heavier. As if both of them understood that whatever came next would matter more than what had already been said. The late sunlight now casting a warm reflection across the table where the untouched contract still rested, its edges glowing softly against the dark wood, no longer just a document, but a quiet reminder of how close everything had come to unraveling. Richard Cole stood still for a moment longer, his gaze drifting briefly toward that folder. Then back to Ava Johnson, and something in his expression shifted. Again, not uncertainty this time, but clarity, the kind that comes after a realization settles fully into place. You were right, he said, and the words were simple, direct, without hesitation, but they carried more weight than anything else spoken that day, because they were not just an acknowledgement of the clause, they were an acknowledgement of her. Ava did not react immediately, not because she did not hear him, but because she understood what it meant, and for someone who had spent most of her life being overlooked, being reduced to the role she was assigned, hearing those words in a room like this did not feel loud, it felt quiet, almost unreal, like something that needed a second to settle into. Truth, she nodded once, a small movement, respectful, grounded, not reaching for more than what had been given. Richard took a slow step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the conversation feel less like a divide and more like a shared space. That deal, he continued, his voice steady, would have cost us everything. And there was no exaggeration in his tone, no dramatics, just a clear understanding of the scale, the risk, the consequence that had been sitting inches away from becoming reality. Ava's eyes flicked briefly toward the table again, then back to him. "It was written to look safe," she said. "But it was not." And her words carried no judgment, only observation, the kind that did not seek credit, only clarity. Richard gave a slight nod, his mind already moving through the implications, the teams that had reviewed it, the assumptions that had been made, the trust that had gone unquestioned, and for the first time in a long time, he did not try to justify it. Did not try to smooth it over with process or explanation, he simply accepted it. "We missed it," he said, and the admission was quiet but complete, no qualifiers, no deflection, just truth, and that truth shifted the space between them even further, removing the last remnants of hierarchy that had defined the beginning of the meeting. Ava stood as she had before, steady, composed, not stepping forward into recognition, not stepping back into invisibility, just standing in the space she had earned by choosing to speak when it mattered. Richard's gaze remained on her, not analyzing, not measuring, just seeing, really seeing, and after a brief pause he asked, "What is your name?" And the question, though simple, carried a different weight now, not because he needed to know, but because he should have asked earlier. Ava answered without hesitation. "Ava Johnson." Her voice clear, and he repeated it once under his breath, as if committing it to memory, as if making sure it would not be overlooked again. "Ava," he said, this time with intention, and there was a shift in the way the name existed in the room, no longer attached to a role or a uniform, but to a person who had just changed. The outcome of something far larger than herself, and as the last of the daylight stretched across the floor, fading slowly into the evening, the moment settled into something quiet but undeniable, a recognition that did not need to be announced, because it had already taken root and everything that followed the name lingered in the air longer than it should have, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it had finally been given the space it deserved. Ava Johnson stood quietly as Richard Cole let the moment settle, either of them rushing to fill the silence that followed, the last traces of daylight now fading into a softer glow that reflected faintly across the glass walls of the boardroom, turning the sharp edges of the city outside into something distant, almost blurred. Richard glanced once more at the closed contract on the table, then back at Ava, and this time when he spoke, there was no distance left in his voice. No barrier of title or position. "You should not have had to speak up like that," he said, not as a reprimand, but as a recognition of what the moment had required from her. Ava held his gaze steady, not defensive, not seeking agreement, just present in the truth of what had already happened. "But I did," she replied softly, and there was no tension in her tone, no need to justify it, only a quiet certainty that she would make the same choice again if she had to. Richard nodded slowly, absorbing that, understanding that what had taken place was not just about a contract or a misdetail, it was about someone choosing to act despite knowing they were not expected to, and that carried a weight that could not be reduced to process or policy. He took a small step back, his hand brushing lightly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself in the reality of the moment. "Ava," he said again, more firmly this time, as if anchoring the name in something that would not be forgotten. "I want you to walk me through exactly what you saw." And the request was not casual, it was deliberate, an invitation into a space she had not been allowed in before. Ava hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not out of doubt, but because she understood what that meant. She moved closer to the table, not quickly, not cautiously, just naturally, as if the space had finally opened for her to step into it, her fingers resting lightly near the edge of the folder as she began to explain, her voice calm, precise, each word measured not to impress but to clarify. And Richard listened without interrupting, without redirecting, his attention fixed entirely on her explanation, following each point as if rebuilding the understanding he had nearly finalized moments earlier. The room, once filled with voices and layered authority, now held only the quiet exchange between them, and in that quiet, something shifted again, not dramatic, not visible to anyone outside those walls, but real. As Ava finished outlining the structure of the clause and the implications hidden within it, Richard exhaled slowly, the weight of what had been avoided settling more clearly into place. You saw what my entire legal team missed, he said, not as praise. Not exaggerated, just stated as fact. Ava did not respond right away, her eyes dropping briefly to the table before returning to him. I just looked closely, she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more depth than any explanation could, because it revealed what had been missing all along, not intelligence, not resources, but attention. Richard let out a faint breath, something between reflection and acceptance, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching again. But this time it did not feel uncertain, it felt resolved, as if something that had been misaligned was now settling into place. The lights above flickered slightly as the building shifted into evening mode, softening the brightness of the room, and in that gentle transition, Richard made a decision that did not need to be announced loudly, one that formed quietly but firmly beneath the surface. You are not going back to the wall, he said, his voice steady, not asking, not suggesting, just stating what had already become clear, and Ava stood there, absorbing the words, not reacting with surprise, not stepping into expectation, but simply standing in the space that had finally opened, a space she had stepped into not because she was invited, but because she had chosen to be seen. The room had grown dimmer, not dark, but softened by the evening light that now filtered through the tall glass windows, turning the sharp lines of the city into quiet reflections that moved gently across the floor. Ava Johnson stood beside the table, no longer near the wall, no longer positioned at the edge of someone else's space, her hand resting lightly near the closed contract as if grounding herself in the reality of what had just unfolded, while Richard Cole remained across from her, his posture no longer defined by authority alone but by something steadier, something that carried awareness, the kind that comes only after a moment that cannot be undone. He looked at the folder once more, then slowly reached forward and slid it away from the center of the table, not dramatically, not with force. Just enough to make it clear that the decision it represented had already passed, that it no longer held power over what came next, the motion quiet but final, and in that small action, the entire outcome of the day settled into place without needing further explanation. Ava watched the movement, her expression unchanged, not searching for validation, not reacting with relief, just observing as the weight of the moment shifted into something still, something complete. Richard exhaled slowly, his hand resting flat against the table for a brief second before he stepped back, creating space not out of distance, but out of respect. We almost missed it, he said quietly, not looking at her immediately, but letting the truth exist in the room without being directed. Ava's eyes followed the fading light across the surface of the table, the reflection stretching thinner as the sun dipped lower. But you did not, she replied, her voice calm, steady, and there was no pride in it, no emphasis, just a simple acknowledgement of what had happened, and somehow that made it stronger. Richard gave a slight nod, accepting that, not as a correction, but as a completion of the moment. He turned his attention back to her, not as a CEO addressing someone beneath him, but as a person recognizing another person who had made a difference when it mattered most. Tomorrow, he said, the word deliberate, grounded. You are going to sit at this table. And there was no hesitation in his tone, no uncertainty, just a quiet decision that had already taken shape. Ava did not respond immediately, not because she doubted it, but because she understood what it meant, not just for her, but for the space itself, for the boundaries that had been silently drawn long before she walked into that room. She glanced once more at the chair nearest to her, the one that had remained empty through the entire meeting, then back at him, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in her expression, not surprise, not disbelief, but something softer, something that settled deep rather than rising to the surface. I will be ready, she said, and the words carried no hesitation, only quiet certainty. Richard held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, just enough to acknowledge that the moment had come full circle, that something had been corrected without needing to be declared. The lights above dimmed slightly as the building transitioned fully into evening, casting a warmer tone across the room, softening everything it touched. Ava stepped back from the table then, not retreating, not leaving, just allowing the space to exist as it now was, changed in a way that could not be reversed. And as she turned toward the door, her reflection moved. alongside her in the glass, no longer blending into the background, but standing clear, defined, present, while behind her the contract remained closed, untouched, its pages silent, its consequence unfulfilled, and in that quiet, with no voices left to fill it, the room held something rare, something that did not need to be spoken, the stillness of a decision not made, and the quiet weight of a truth that had finally been seen.